Ya.
Kasih kode ya.
Baru 8 Kang sekarang Kang. Tunggu sebentar.
Kenapa Mas Andre?
Ini pesertanya belum
Peserta
muncul.
sudah banyak, sudah 91 masuk.
Oh ya.
Oke, kita mulai ya.
Kelihatan?
Lagi on the way masuk, Pak.
Oke. Boleh dengar sekarang? Boleh dengar?
Dengar, Pak, dengar.
Pak Tony.
Oke. Boleh nampak juga? Oke. Untuk saya boleh nampak, boleh dengar juga. Baik. Oke. Oh, mati lagi. Aduh.
Tidak, Pak, aman, Pak.
Oke.
Ya. Peserta sudah masuk 107 peserta.
Dari mana?
Dari seluruh Indonesia.
Dari pihak perguruan tinggi atau dari apa aja?
Banyak, Pak.
Oke.
Pak Boni, boleh silakan dimulai.
Ya. Sudah ya?
Sudah, Pak Bodi, silakan.
Oke. Selamat pagi kawan-kawan semua, kawan-kawan obor saya sebut seperti itu ya, penerbit obor. Pada pagi hari ini kita akan mendiskusikan sebuah karya magnum opus dari Profesor Anthony Reid. Dua volume buku, Asia Tenggara dalam Kurun Niaga atau Southeast Asia in the Age of Commerce, yang telah terbit terjemahan bahasa Indonesianya, dan buku ini sangat baik, sangat bagus. Buku ini diberi kata pengantar oleh dua orang sejarawan hebat. Yang pertama adalah Dr. Ponghokham dan juga Profesor Asfi Warman Adam. Buku ini menjadi menarik karena dia mengkaji, kalau menurut Ponghokham ini satu kajian sejarah total yang melihat Asia Tenggara dari berbagai perspektif, dari berbagai hal, dari mulai geografis, kemudian demografi, kemudian juga kaitan kebudayaan yang seringkali kita lupakan. Jadi seringkali kita sebagai warga Indonesia di negara yang modern ini lupa bahwa beberapa abad lalu sejatinya Nusantara ini menjadi satu kesatuan wilayah di Asia Tenggara yang terkoneksikan satu sama lain, yang juga banyak melakukan interaksi perdagangan, kebudayaan yang membentuk kita di hari ini, kira-kira seperti itu. Jadi seringkali juga kita merasa, saya pribadi misalkan merasa heran sendiri kalau misalkan kita marah-marah ada negara tetangga kita mengadopsi satu atau dua produk kebudayaan kita yang sebetulnya mereka juga sudah punya itu, karena perspektif geopolitik kita mengacu kepada negara modern Indonesia, bukan kepada kesatuan wilayah Nusantara yang dulu merentang jejaringnya atau hubungannya di wilayah Asia Tenggara. Nah, buku ini menjelaskan itu semua. Buku ini menjelaskan dengan sangat baik bagaimana konektivitas gitu ya, masyarakat di Asia Tenggara dalam kurun Niaga, dan ini memperkaya perspektif kita bukan hanya tentang Asia Tenggara, tapi khususnya tentang Indonesia sendiri. Ya. Jadi ini semacam fondasi cakrawala berpikir kita mengenai sejarah Indonesia sebelum kita menjadi sebuah negara modern yang bernama Indonesia ini. Pak Anthony Reid ini lahir di New Zealand, di Selandia Baru, tahun 1939, usianya 81 tahun, masih segar bugar, masih sehat, ya, dan semoga kita doakan terus panjang umur dan sehat, terutama di masa pandemi yang sangat berbahaya ini. Pak Anthony Reid ini lulus dari Cambridge University, dan saya yang paling terkesan yaitu bukunya tentang revolusi sosial di Sumatera Timur. Dan di dalam buku itu dia menjelaskan bagaimana pertarungan, ya, atau perebutan pengaruh pada masa transisi periode dari Jepang, sebelumnya nyambung ke periode kolonial, ke periode dekolonisasi yang sangat penting juga untuk kajian sejarah Indonesia. Pak Tony akan menyampaikan pembicaraannya dalam bahasa Inggris. Nanti setelah itu akan ada sesi diskusi, dan saya anjurkan untuk panitia untuk peserta bisa mengirimkan pertanyaannya secara tertulis. Ya. Syukur-syukur bisa di dalam bahasa Inggris gitu ya, atau bahasa Indonesia juga nggak apa-apa, di dalam kolom tertulis. Ini ada beberapa pengumuman dari panitia. Satu, saat ikut Zoom ini diharapkan menggunakan nama yang benar, bukan nama samaran, ya. Kemudian pakaiannya rapi, ya. Kemudian disarankan agar menggunakan headset. Kemudian selama diskusi berlangsung, audio wajib posisi dimatikan, ya, di mute, tidak di unmute. Kemudian kalau ada peserta yang membuat kegaduhan, ini panitia bisa mengeluarkan seketika, tapi tanpa melaporkannya ke polisi tentu saja. Terima kasih. Pak Tony will give his talk today in English. I think I don't have to give more introduction about him because I already give in bahasa. And please, Pak Tony, this is your turn as our speaker today.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Boni. Walaupun dia bilang ya saya sehat atas 80 tahun, tapi sebenarnya cepat capek. Ini saya I apologize for speaking in English because I find I do get tired and I don't achieve as much in a day as I used to. So sorry, but we'll have a little bit of bahasa campur, but I want to just introduce mostly in English if I can. And I thought I would begin by going back to when I was trying to write this book, Southeast Asia in the Age of Commerce. And later, of course, it's translated as Tenggara dalam Kurun Niaga. It was not easy. It was, when I think back and compare it with today, I think it would have been very difficult for me or anybody to write such a book in the conditions of today, when the universities are under so much pressure to produce, publish or perish. You have to keep publishing in peer-reviewed journals. You have to get grants. You have to do this, and you have to have so many students, or else you lose your job. I was very lucky. In the 1970s and 80s, I had a full-time research position, and it was secure. It was tenured. It was tetap, and that's a very luxurious thing. Now looking back, how lucky I was. I could spend 10 years doing this book, and nobody told me I would lose my job if I didn't, hurry up. So, and that's very different now. So I'm grateful for that, and it was a lucky time and a lucky position for me. But because it was ambitious, and I'm going to try to say the kind of hambatan, for me, it was partly dalam otak sendiri. You know, it wasn't just external, it was internal. I did not feel able to do this at first. I thought, you know, I had written my thesis about Indonesia and about the 19th century, and then I had done more work on the 1940s, and I was not authorized, you know, to write about the 16th, 17th century, and I was not authorized to write about Vietnam and Thailand and Burma. And so, these things were, you know, who was I? Who was I to think that I could say something new about the whole of Southeast Asia? And for me, I suppose the inspiration of Brodel, and you mentioned Ong Hok Ham's introduction, talking about the Anal school and Brodel and this Histoire Totale, total history, atau sejarah lengkap dari this book. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah. Okay. Of Brodel that's the English version that came out in the early 70s, I think. I already was a little aware of it when it was a French book, but it helped in several ways. Firstly, by saying we could make the sea a unifying factor. In his case, the Mediterranean Sea. He could write about that as if it was a principle of unity, although usually we think it's a division. And we, especially the Mediterranean, the north is Europe, is Christian, the south is Arab and Muslim. I mean, they have so little to do with each other, so little conversation between each. So, I mean, it was very brani, you know, very bold of him to think he could do that. For me, Southeast Asia looks much more unified than his Mediterranean. And so I could, you know, the Sea of Southeast Asia, Laut Java, and a larger Laut Java, shall we say, is more of a unifying feature than the Mediterranean. So that was a factor. He also, he called for this kind of total history, which could use many disciplines. I mean, not just history, which has mostly been used to discuss political history, to discuss the history of what we call kings and battles, or, you know, the history of the state. That's what history was in the 19th century when it was invented. It was about the national histories of Europe, and then it gradually expanded to become global, but it's still focused on the state. So Brodel said he could draw upon geography, especially geography in his case, and Oriental studies, as it was called, and some anthropology, and to understand the whole system and how life was in that period. So again, it seemed to me easier. That was an invitation to say, yes, okay, it's hard for you to do in the Mediterranean. It's not so hard in Southeast Asia because it has a common environment. It is a wet, hot place. It is what we call the humid tropics. And that determines how agriculture works and how living styles work, how people house themselves and dress themselves and so forth is largely what they eat is a response to the common environment. So in my case, I used a lot of anthropology, especially anthropology, because although anthropology is mostly talking about now, it's field workers go to a place and tell us what a village life is like, but they do it in detail. And so we understand something about how actual communities at the grassroots level, the basis of community, how they work, how people live, how people make love, how people eat, and how people sleep, and how people, combine and fight and so forth. So for me, although I had to say, this is not this, the work of Clifford Geertz or somebody is not talking about the 16th century, and yet we can take much of that and say, yes, some things still need to be explained to a reader who lives somewhere else. How you eat rice and what happens if rice is the center of your life, and as it were, of your sustenance. So I used, of course, also geography, geology, but so I could try to use everything in order to try to access what made Southeast Asia a place from the point of view of ordinary people's lives. And I did find that it was liberating to be able to forget about the state for a while and to look at how people live. So what Brodel did, he had the three divisions of structure or structures, conjoncture or connections, and événement or events. And the events is what we call political history. That's the sort of stuff, one king falls, another king rises, they have a fight or something. That's political history. But that he was trying to say, that is just the detail of the surface of events. The more fundamental changes, whether you change your diet, whether you change your whole way of interacting between men and women, whether you change your the whole relationship to nature. I mean, these things are fundamental and they change. And so we should look at that also. So the interdisciplinary thing was part of what gave me a inspiration or courage to write what really I was not authorized to write. But then nobody was authorized to write it, I suppose. The next big thing was writing beyond my own expertise, country expertise. And that, I mean, for me, we have to go back, and I've been trying to go back and remember how it was recently. For me, I'm a post-colonial generation. So I grew up especially in the 50s. I was a teenager, and I started to define myself in the 50s when we were anti-colonial. We hated colonialism and racism because that's what, and our Britishness, the Britishness of Australia and New Zealand. That's what our parents were immersed in, that world, which was all about Britishness and colonial, the British Empire, and pride about that. We wanted to reject that completely. And for us, Southeast Asia, this place on the doorstep that was suddenly becoming independent and exciting, and new things were happening, that was the challenge and the measure of how we show we're doing better than our parents' generation. We're not colonial. So it was an anti-colonial mood, I think, everywhere in the world. And in my case, and I think many others, but certainly in my case, I never wanted to hear anybody write another word about colonialism. I just wanted to throw that out and write about something else, with the basic perspective from the region itself, from the people themselves. What I suppose started to dominate by the 1960s, when I started being a historian and writing stuff, was Cornell and the American Area Studies model. And we sometimes say Cornell University invented Asia Tenggara. Well, tidak benar. I've spent a lot of time trying to say that's completely false. But it was true. They invented a kind of area studies based on Southeast Asia, how to do it when you're outside Southeast Asia, how to organize language teaching for the messy bits of Asia and Asian languages that are left over when the big languages of Chinese, Japanese, Hindi dealt with. Otherwise, you've got these other smaller languages left. What do you do? I mean, it was a way of dealing with that very efficiently and training people in the national language and in the discipline. But in terms of actually writing about Southeast Asia, Cornell didn't do it. The first 20 years of Cornell University's Southeast Asian studies, they never wrote anything about Southeast Asia as a whole. Every thesis, every publication was on one country. And people were, yes, they were encouraged to know something about the whole region, but basically because they were fixated, as many were, with trying to reject colonialism and therefore sympathize with the nationalisms that were opposed to colonialism. The essence of how you do history was to do it nationally, to provide a history for Indonesia or for Malaysia or for Vietnam, which is what the nationalists themselves were trying to do, and the outsiders were also trying to do something like that. And so to say, no, I want to study the whole region, and to say that the whole region has makes sense, has coherence, that was a big, slightly dangerous step. And many of my colleagues thought I was gila sekali, you know, you cannot. You don't know Vietnamese, you don't know Burmese, you don't know. I tried to learn Thai, but yeah, sedikit sekali. So nitnoy, I got to say nitnoy, not much Thai. But it was, I suppose for me, I was a little different from some in that although my first experiences were in Indonesia as a teenager, when I started to practice my profession of a historian in the university, I was in Malaysia. So I learned how to be a Southeast Asian historian by teaching Southeast Asian history, not in Indonesia, not in Australia, but in Malaysia. And so, of course, and moreover, my dissertation, which was about the Aceh War, this one. So it's called The Contest for North Sumatra. For me, dalam perang Aceh itu ada tiga pihak, bukan saja Aceh lawan Belanda, tapi kaum British juga, British dengan Singapurnya dan Penangnya juga lawan Belanda dari segi kebebasan dagang. I mean, so it was, I mean, that's why the Aceh War lasted so long, because the British were supporting the Acehnese up to a point. I mean, the British in Penang, the Penang lobby, if you can say, the merchants of Penang and Singapore thought, we don't want the Dutch to control this place. We want to be able to trade freely, because Singapore and Penang had long been the entrepot, the central ports for trade and for many things. Somewhat like Singapore became later for Southeast Asia. So I was already, although I'm an Indonesianist, only licensed to study, to write about Indonesia perhaps, but I already wanted to write about Malaysia because I'd been there for 5 years teaching there. And my next big project after the dissertation on Perang Aceh was a kind of comparison. The book Bonnie referred to, tentang Revolusi Sosial di Sumatra. It was a kind of contrast in my mind between Sumatra yang membasmikan pada waktu 40-an, tahun 40-an, waktu revolusi, membasmikan raja-raja dan sultan-sultan di Aceh dan Sumatera Timur. Tapi pada waktu yang sama di Malaysia, mereka dukung sultannya, justru mendukung sebagai lambang kemelayuannya terhadap kaum lain, kaum Tionghoa dan India dan British dan segala. Jadi, I mean, that contrast was so striking when you live in Malaysia and then work on Indonesia, on Sumatra. I wanted to explain that. How can you explain? And I spent a lot of time, I suppose, thinking about that. What makes Indonesia different? Because it had a revolution. It didn't just have a struggle for independence. It had a revolution that overthrew everything and declared a new legality. The old legality was upwards. So that's a revolution. That's when you say that doesn't, that old legality doesn't apply because we have overthrown that legality. Of course, it was not complete. Of course, Dutch law didn't disappear, but it lost its strength, its credibility, and it was a new start. So that's, I suppose, why I was a little already, like you mentioned, thinking Nusantara, thinking there's more than one place in Southeast Asia, and I can do that. I can talk about two countries, but in teaching the whole of Southeast Asia, and then in traveling around and eating the food and seeing the environment and sensing things, I could see that there was a very obvious area of commonality once you are looking at ordinary people's ordinary lives and not looking at the state and the colonial influence and the formal religion. I mean, when you look at the religious system today, you think was completely different. Buddhism one here, Christianity there, and Islam in the south. But if you ask people about what they really think happens when people die, and what they really think about, spirits and the kind of unseen world, it's a very different mindset from what a European mindset is about those things. For most people, I mean, of course, there are people who don't pay any attention to that and regard themselves as just Buddhist, just Muslim. But for most people, this is a very real, what you might call popular religion, is a very real thing, and it's a commonality throughout Southeast Asia, that there is a level of understanding that unseen world that coexists with our visible world. And I think I'm right in saying if you asked Southeast Asians about that unseen world and you asked Europeans or Australians, you would get very different answers. I mean, from the two. I mean, as to whether this world is real, the world of what happens after you die. There was. It took some courage to do this, but especially because I didn't want to write a history of Southeast Asia like the existing histories, which meant D.G.E. Hall or Brian Harrison, or of course before that Cerdès in French, which really, for the last 500 years anyway, maybe the first 1,000 years, that they could see, when they look at the Indianized kingdoms, they could see that actually, Buddhist Cambodia and Buddhist Sumatra and Hindu Java and Hindu Hinduism more generally, that these are commonalities, the what I call the Tenggara of Southeast Asia at that time, the Indic states. But when they came to the last 500 years, it was all, you just add together the national stories to make it. I mean, it's a chapter on Vietnam and a chapter on Indonesia, like that. I, on the contrary, I wanted to say, I have something new to say here about, firstly, how Southeast Asia makes sense as a whole, And secondly, I mean, that's volume 1, if you like, the Lands Below the Winds, Tanah di Bawah Angin. That's about how Southeast Asia is a different place from other places. And the second volume is about how the period is different, what changed in the whole region fundamentally because of this age of commerce. And I suppose the big change is a religious change, the most obvious visible one, but it had many other dimensions. I guess that was more brave, and I was very anxious that it would be a failure, until some reviews started to come out. I remember picking up when Clifford Geertz wrote a review of the first volume in the New York Review of Books, which is something, I look up to as you're really something if you're reviewed in the New York Review of Books. But he began it in a way that I thought he was going to say, this is ridiculous. This is absolute. He said something about, of all the sort of dumb projects waiting for somebody to do, this takes the cake. As if, what took anybody so long to do it? It's too obvious, as it were, that somebody should have done it. And who is this Reed fellow? He just wrote a couple of books about Sumatra, but he wanted, about the role. He has no, but then he ended up saying, actually, he did a good job. So, thank God for that. I was okay. I suppose as a result of this, the book being okay, it helped make my career, I suppose. As something more than a student of Sumatra or whatever. I became subsequently a kind of promoter or champion of this idea that we can write about Southeast Asia. I must have more books with Southeast Asia in the title than anybody else. And it's, so it obviously became a thing I was comfortable with. And I think part of the reason for that is that whereas like my generation as a whole, I think I was enthusiastic about the new nationalisms and the new nation states that arose in Southeast Asia, including and preeminently Indonesia, such a new state, such a new beginning, so full of hope for new things. But disillusion comes inevitably. I mean, it always comes, I suppose, if you start with unrealistic hopes like that. And of course, once nationalism was no longer the idea of the underdog, the idea of the yang di bawah, and it became the idea of yang di atas, of the idea of the government, of the state imposing this idea. That also made me less comfortable with it. And of course, the killings in 1965, for a lot of people, were a kind of, disillusion. I mean, maybe more dramatic in Ben Anderson's case than in mine, but we all, could not feel quite the same about Indonesian nationalism after that. But above all, there's the problem of the outsider trying to critique or engage with nationalist history. I preferred not to do it. I preferred to say, no, that's okay. That's what Indonesians are doing and should be doing, trying to figure out what this state is all about. But that's not what I should be doing and what I kind of wanted to do. So I found that I was naturally, I think I've rather seldom written about Indonesia as such. So it's interesting looking back. Why did that happen? I have often written below the nation state about Aceh, about the Batak, about Makassar, and about Sabah in Malaysia, in East Malaysia Timor. And then often in trying to make sense of the Southeast Asian. So I suppose that's something that happened, and perhaps I need to explain why I did that, and why I became a little associated with the idea of Southeast Asia as a way to escape from the exaggerated importance of the nation state. I mean, again, this is part of how one changes through life and how the world changes. It seems to me the idea of the nation state as the only absolute, the only identity for which you're allowed to kill other people and allowed to, be killed yourself in the name of the state, that makes it okay, whereas others not. I mean, that whole absoluteness of the state, it seems to have passed, and I say thank God for that. We're now more aware that we live in a planet, we share one very fragile and very wonderful planet, the only planet in the whole universe that seems to be so wonderful and have all this life and all this diversity and all this marvelous things that make life good. That we all share this, and we have to look after it above all. So I guess that has accentuated this idea that I'm not so not so sure about writing at the nation state level, but we certainly still need the states. Of course, we still need states. So, I thought I'd say a word in ending. I mean, where am I at now? And that I should say about this book, which is that's my sort of buku penutup, you might say, my farewell to being a Southeast Asian historian. Of course, I write a few other things still, but in a way, I had a chance, and that was a general history of Southeast Asia from the beginning to now, and at least from the beginning of the Indian states, and where you can start to have much to say. And I wanted to say three things in that book. Of course, the publisher wanted it to be textbook for Southeast Asian history, and I thought, okay, but I actually want to say something. I want to say something new, which I usually do. I mean, want to sort of fix on an idea. So I begin that by saying, there are three reasons why I think Southeast Asian history matters to the whole world, not just to Southeast Asia. And of course, every place matters. But I wanted to emphasize first its relative statelessness. Jadi bahwa negara atau nation state is not everything. It's not. It is now. This is an argument you can make about every part of the world. That the state is not the real only story that we should be telling, that the story of states and their competition with each other. But it's particularly evident in Southeast Asia, where a lot of the population of Southeast Asia did not have states until maybe around 1900, until 100 tahun yang lalu. They didn't really have states, and yet they had perfectly good, happy, productive lives. And, their agriculture system, like if you look at Batak sawah, a system of rice cultivation among Batak, or in Bali, or among the Ifugao in Luzon in the Philippines, the people who rejected the state, who said, no, if the state is coming at the coasts, we're going to step back. No, we don't want to be dominated by this state, whether the state is Islamic state or the state is a colonial state. Either way, no, you keep it. We will be happy up in the highlands by ourselves, or in small islands. Actually, when you think about the extent to which states dominated society, dominated what people thought and what they did, it seems to me that traditional history has greatly exaggerated it everywhere, but especially in Southeast Asia, where the non-state actors were really very important. It's perhaps among the best examples of a high civilization with a written culture which did not need a single state, a unifying state. Even Java. I mean, maybe Java is a good example. That, I mean, really it only was united under one state, under Sultan Agung. I mean, it wasn't unified before that, and it wasn't unified after that. But we know what a Javanese is. We know what Javanese culture is. We know what the wayang is. We know the stories that are dear to Javanese. Why? Because of performance and because of religion. I mean, that the ideas that were sacred were passed around. And when you look at other societies, that's often the case, that what has united them is not actually a state saying, this is what you should think, and this is what our national culture is. That was beginning maybe to happen in the late 18th, early 19th century, but still it wasn't the case. For most, it was religion and it was performance, I think, that united. So that's my first point about why I think Southeast Asia is not just something you have to study if you're the Bangku Scholar, but something that matters. And the second thing is gender. Maybe it should be the first thing. But I've, ever since writing The Age of Commerce and becoming convinced that the older pattern of gender relations in Southeast Asia was extremely balanced, by contrast with not only Europe, but contrast with China, contrast with India, contrast with Japan. It makes Southeast Asia important as a different way of doing gender, where women were productive. They dominated a whole range of activity, especially commerce, but also including, planting rice, harvesting rice, and so on, and textiles, things like that. I mean, when you go to India, you find surprise. Men do the textile. Men do almost everything. So it's Southeast Asian women had their own autonomy because they had their own income, their own place in the economy, which made them as productive and as wealthy, therefore, as men. Therefore, high divorce rates. If a woman got tired of a man, she really didn't need him because she had her own source of income. I mean, that kind of thing. So I spent more time, of course, in the new book trying to say, yes, okay, this is the traditional pattern, which I think I argued successfully in the Kurun Niaga volume. So what happened in modernity? Is that still true? And it's obviously not so true now, but it's still, it looks a better, more balanced pattern than other parts of Asia. But I had to explain why modernity was very male as it came to Southeast Asia in the form of a colonial modernity which was exclusively male. I mean, that the Europeans who had a model of what their modernity was about and who you look for if you're going to look for collaborators in running a business or running a government, they only look for men. And it was the assumption. And the women are supposed to stay home according to this modernity of Europe around 1900, when modernity became such an exciting thing to Southeast Asians. So that's the second thing. And the third thing, which I suppose is a more recent preoccupation of mine since the tsunami in 2004 in Aceh, is that it's a fragile place, this Southeast Asia. I mean, more so Sumatra, Java, Bali, but also in the Philippines, it's fragile in terms of earthquakes, eruptions, and typhoon, and also Vietnam. So I mean, it's more fragile a place. Its fertility, which I talked about in the Age of Commerce book, how easy it is to farm, to grow rice and other crops in this very fertile soil, made fertile by the volcanoes. But of course, sharing your life with volcanoes is a dangerous business, and also with tsunamis. So I'm that's the third thing that I think is unique about Southeast Asia, which the rest of the world needs to understand, how Southeast Asia dealt with these three factors. So this is partly a pitch to Obor. Maybe time you translated this book. So that's Iklan sudah selesai. Okay, I maybe stop there.
Thank you, Pak Tony, for sharing your knowledge and also your experiences when you wrote this book, this wonderful book. You know, when I was read your book, I was wondering how you did your research. I mean, how you could access to historical sources. Of course, you just mentioned earlier that you are not expertise in Vietnamese or in Thailand, but you can access those archives, for example, to get information from the past about certain place in Southeast Asia. And I was wondering how you dug the information, how you did the research, how you collect the archive, and then access the historical sources. That is, make me curious. You know, as a historian, I think it is not easy for me to, just to what you call it, to study Dutch, for example. It is not easy for me, and also I don't speak English very fluently.
Oh, it's fine.
But of course, for me, as a historian, how could you please share how you did the research? And then the second thing that I would like to know from you is that in the first volume of your book, you written about the outbreak and also the endemic diseases in the South Asia. It's kind of prophecy. It's kind of it's kind of what you call it. Did you see any pattern, historical pattern that makes you explain or you written about this part, about the diseases, about the outbreaks in Southeast Asia, because we are now during the COVID-19 outbreaks.
Yeah.
And I think that is two questions from me. So we also have several questions from a participant.
So you want to have a lot of questions together, or
maybe you can answer my question first, then I will read for you the question from the participants.
Okay. So the sources, it's interesting. As you say, it's daunting. I mean, the Dutch is a lot, but by the time I was doing this, I had already been, for my dissertation, I found I was very slow. I really was very aware that my Dutch counterparts, some Dutch students, they could go through this Dutch material so fast, and I was so slow. But I got better over the years, so that became easier. And it's wonderful how much of the Dutch sources were printed in the colonial era already. That the Dag Register, for example, and those General Missiva, well, that was after the post-colonial that those were printed, and then the other volumes, Dahan and so forth. So I mean, there's a lot of documents that are already printed. I mean, so I didn't actually try to read, and I'm full of admiration for the people who are, finding this stuff in the archives of the VOC. They wrote so much, these Dutchmen. The trouble with studying Indonesian history, there's so much to read in Dutch. So I didn't go that far down to try to read the handwriting of VOC officials or Portuguese officials. Of course, I went to the archives, and but the essence of the level at which I was doing it, I was looking at the published letters, and the Dutch published a great deal of letters and reports, and the Portuguese also published quite a lot, and the voyages also published. But what I think I did that was a bit different was that although my anti-colonial generation didn't want to know too much about colonialism, so the tendency was with, like the Cornell model I described, when you started to get into earlier history, you tried to use the indigenous sources. That was how you became, free from colonialist perspective. You try to read the babats and the hikayats and so forth. But of course, that's very limiting because it's so focused on the kraton and the rajas and their perspective. It's necessary, and you get a sense. So for that material, the babads, the hikayats, and all that, and also the Vietnamese chronicles and the Thai Burmese chronicles, I was reliant on those wonderful people who produced textual editions in at least in Romanized form, and sometimes with nice translations into English or French or something. So that was the level at which but besides using those, I discovered that the first generation of foreigners who came to Southeast Asia always wrote a lot about how amazing it all was, how people do things differently. Only the first generation, they described, the amazing book of Ludewig's, the Eerste Schriftblad of the Dutch, which one day, if I live to be 150, I might translate that because it's a wonderful document of what life was like in Banten in the 1598 or so. Because everything was new, everything was written down about how do they eat and how do they, Chinese and Javanese get around each other, and how do they write, and how do they do this and that, and how do they do accounts, how do they trade. So, I mean, it's that first generation is wonderful, almost like anthropologists, that for them, the way of life is new and needs to be described. And so that I relied on a lot. Rather than saying, oh, that's colonial, I don't want to know. I used it a great deal, including in the Philippines. There was plenty of Catholic missionaries who wrote a lot when they first arrived. Again, they described everything that was new and surprising, and they especially described, because it was like the enemy, they described the religious system. What did these people in the Philippines believe about the spirits and so forth? And so, although they were trying to combat this belief, and these the priestesses, they were women who were often the mediums with the spirits and so forth, they described it with some detail, more detail than you find looking for Muslim sources that describe who they're up against. It's hard to find good examples from the Islamic literature to do that, but the Christians did that, and so that helped me believe that I could extend this idea. I could get a sense of why, what the belief system was at the level. Oh, that's the sources. And disease pattern, yeah, it is important. And if I were writing it now, maybe I'd write more. I do think that the interaction between tropical world and the temperate world, I mean, I've sort of thought a lot about it subsequently. Why did China stop expanding? Why did China over the millennia, for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, has been gradually moving southward and absorbing what were people more like Southeast Asians into becoming part of China. So, I mean, I think the disease pattern is a big thing. The Chinese had an advantage with smallpox. For them, smallpox was endemic. For Southeast Asians, that was a terrible thing, and it could cause ravages, as with Europeans. So it never became endemic until at least much later. Whereas tropical disease, especially malaria, was killing the Chinese. So when they started to invade Vietnam and Burma, they died horribly, and they called it, the miasma or something like that. It was something like malaria, because they had no exposure. So that they eventually gave up, more because of the disease than because of. So I mean, these. Now we live in a global world, but I suspect it's still true that the tropical response to COVID-19 is significantly different to the cold weather. I mean, it's more acute in the cold. We know that. From winter is much worse than summer. I presume it's an advantage to Southeast Asians that it's always summer, as it were. It's always warm. And it seems COVID-19 doesn't like that so much. But it's not enough, of course. And certainly, I mean, what's so new about this is not just that it's not a new epidemic. I mean, it's not unprecedented in any way, except that our response to it is very unprecedented. We never could have a global response like this, where everybody is comparing their strategy and what to do, and it's affecting the whole planet. We're all, ruining our economies to combat this. That never happened before, because we couldn't. We didn't have the technology. So that's. But no, I haven't got anything special to say about COVID-19. But kasihan, it's not. I'm glad I'm old and not having to adjust my teaching to this kind of thing. But it's like this Zoom. It's amazing. I mean, that we can do this.
Yeah, thank you, Pak. Kawan-kawan sekalian, saya tadi lupa menjelaskan intisari dari, semoga saya yakin teman-teman semua hadirin yang ikut diskusi ini bisa memahami apa yang disampaikan oleh Pak Tony di awal tadi dalam penjelasannya. Jadi Pak Tony ini sebagai generasi yang lahir setelah generasi yang bukan lahir, yang tumbuh ya setelah Perang Dunia Kedua, di mana dunia mengalami perubahan besar, di negara-negara koloni merdeka, dan dia menjadi seorang yang terlahir sebagai sebuah generasi postkolonial yang juga mencoba memberikan makna atau menafsirkan perubahan yang terjadi di dunia pada saat dia tumbuh. Kemudian juga Pak Tony mengatakan dia lebih fokus melihat sejarah dari rakyat, jadi people history. Dia mengatakan, kalau saya tidak salah menerjemahkan, dia tidak, negara buat dia, buat Pak Tony ini penting, tetap penting, tapi dia tidak melihat itu sebagai sebuah hal yang utama dalam kajiannya, karena juga melihat peran negara ini sangat kritis, terutama sekali ketika ideologi nasionalisme yang tadinya menjadi ideologi rakyat, kemudian diadopsi menjadi ideologi elit, menjadi ideologi negara, yang justru malah menjadi alat pemukul bagi yang berbeda dengan ideologi penguasa. Dan ini dia sangat kritis mengenai ini. Dan tadi juga ada pertanyaan mengapa katanya respon rakyat terhadap raja di Malaysia dengan di Indonesia berbeda. Itu juga yang dia sampaikan sebetulnya tadi. Kata Pak Tony, dia melihat ada perbedaan mengapa di Sumatera terjadi revolusi sosial yang meruntuhkan kekuasaan para sultan, para kaum feodal. Sementara di Malaysia, sultan itu dijadikan semacam simbol di dalam kontestasi melawan kolonialisme Inggris, dan juga dalam memperkuat justru identitas kemelayuan di dalam posisi berhadapan dengan identitas-identitas ras lainnya gitu. Jadi ini yang membuat Indonesia, khususnya lagi misalkan dengan studinya Pak Tony ini di Sumatera, berbeda dengan apa yang terjadi di Malaysia. Kemudian juga Pak Tony mengatakan di poin keduanya mengenai gender, perempuan di Asia Tenggara itu memiliki tempat yang spesial. Pada umumnya ya, kita bisa cerita bagaimana di Jawa berbeda lagi misalkan pada masa kolonial. Tapi pada umumnya mengatakan Pak Tony, perempuan di Asia Tenggara memiliki kedudukan penting karena mereka punya pekerjaan dan otonom, gitu ya. Kemudian juga Pak Tony mengatakan Asia Tenggara ini tempat yang sangat tanda kutip ringkih karena dia terkena bencana alam ya, dia terletak di ada ring of fire gitu, yang membuat dia bisa terkena gempa, kemudian tsunami. Jadi Asia Tenggara sendiri sebagai sebuah region, sebagai sebuah wilayah itu sangat rentan terhadap bencana alam. Kemudian Pak Tony juga tadi menyampaikan kita harus kritis, kita harus melihat secara hati-hati mengenai modernitas, karena selama ini modernitas selalu mengacu, selalu merujuk kepada modernitas ukuran atau standar dari apa yang dibawa oleh kolonialisme. Jadi modernitas yang dibawa oleh kolonialisme itu kemudian menjadi rujukan. Ini harus dilihat secara kritis. Kalau saya tidak salah menerjemahkannya ya Pak Tony, mohon maaf kalau saya ada kesalahan menerjemahkan, tapi semoga tidak salah-salah amat gitu. Ada pertanyaan Pak dari peserta. Tadi pertanyaan saya sebetulnya pertama tentang saya penasaran bagaimana Pak Tony menulis buku ini, karena pasti mengakses banyak sumber. Jadi sumber-sumber itu bahasanya macam-macam. Tadi sudah dijelaskan oleh Pak Tony bagaimana dia mengakses sumber, melakukan penelitian. Dan juga saya tertarik pada satu bagian di buku ini mengenai pandemi, mengenai outbreaks atau wabah yang ternyata seperti seperti historical pattern, pola dalam sejarah yang terjadi juga pada masa lalu. Nah, Ini pertanyaan Pak dari tunggu sebentar. Nah, ini sebelum ada sistem negara ini dari Libra Hari, dari Bung Hari ya, sebelum ada negara seperti sekarang di Asia Tenggara. So before we have a state in Southeast Asia, it has a culture, it has a common in culture. So dia bilang what makes a nation in Southeast Asia has a in common culture, has a kemiripan budaya. What is in English? It's a common culture. They share a culture together. And then the second question is from Robi. Apa negeri di bawah angin? What does it mean? Negeri di bawah angin. And then pertanyaan lagi dari Dian, apa faktor yang menyebabkan perbedaan penghargaan terhadap sultan di Indonesia dan sultan di Malaysia pada tahun 1940-an? So what are what makes Raja and Sultan difference in Indonesia and in Malaysia during 1940s? So I think this is related to your book about social revolution in East Sumatra.
Yeah.
And then from Ahmad Fauzan, in chapter 5, volume 1, there are several irregularities where the literacy rate in Southeast Asia has decreased dramatically. Does it use an indicator of new language recognition? And is this likely due to the modern and universalist education system introduced by the newcomers? And that is question from Ahmad Fauzan, Pak.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's all.
Okay. Ya, terima kasih. Menarik semua. Apakah Asia Tenggara punya common culture atau I think perhaps not at the level of really of culture. I mean, before it's clear that colonialism created modern states. I mean, states that did what we expect a modern state to do, with a common currency and a common banking system and a communication system and education system, etc. All of what is part of modernity that was created by the colonial order, and it of course divided Southeast Asia into British, Dutch, French sphere and Spanish. But before that, that was not a common culture. That was a common state. I mean, the borders, of course, were worked out by the colonial powers. So they made the borders. They decided what was this, and they established the common infrastructure of communications, railways, ships, and telegraph and telephone, all those things. And then finally education, which is vital. But they didn't create a nation. They didn't create a sense of common identity. They had no interest in doing that. You could say divide and rule, but it was usually not as conscious as that. Why should we unite these people? That's not our job. It's not what we're here for. So and that was the job of nationalism, of course, that to create a sense of imagined community, of community among these people. But I think that there's two levels to answer the question. At the level of Southeast Asia, where I say there was this commonality, apa sebab ada kesamaan antara Asia Tenggara keseluruhannya, that's only material culture. Jadi kebudayaan benda, the food, the environment, the agriculture, the harvest system, the seasons, the musim, and so the hot and wet and dry seasons and so forth. All of that is so fundamental so that at that level, you have commonality created by the environment. But at the level of, specific culture, like what makes the Javanese Javanese, what makes the Batak Batak, even though they never had a single state saying this is what it is to be Javanese. But maybe Sultan Agung had some of that by the way he defined, religion. Okay, Islam is okay, but the Wayang and the Mahabharata is also okay. That was a king who said you can combine these two and almost enforce that. But I think that those societies' common cultures, not at the Indonesia level or the Southeast Asia level, but at what we think of as specific culture, that's largely religion and performance. That dance and theatre were so important in Southeast Asia. In China, writing was very important. They spoke all different languages, but they wrote in this one language of the written character language. And to get ahead in society, in the world, as a bureaucrat, you had to learn that language. That was a society that's unified by written language. But in Southeast Asian societies, it was, I think, mostly a shared performance plus a shared religion, both before and after Islam, where there were tempat ziarah, there were pilgrimages to central places, sacred places that defined what you think is sacred and important. Okay, negeri di bawah angin itu mudah sekali. Saya cari nama yang indigenous, yang nama dalam untuk Asia Tenggara ini. Ya, tentu Asia Tenggara itu suatu penciptaan baru dari luar barangkali. Orang Eropa ada beberapa nama untuk daerah ini seperti further India atau biasanya modifikasi dari India. Jadi Asia Tenggara ada dalam India yang besar, tapi akhirnya ya seperti akhirnya India Belanda dan India Inggris. Dua India. Tapi ada beberapa nama untuk India ini, Meridional India atau Tropical Indian Archipelago. But saya cari yang dari dalam, dan dalam budaya dan pusaka Melayu, seperti sejarah Melayu dan segala itu yang menulis dalam bahasa Melayu, daerah ini jelas dinamakan tanah di bawah angin atau kadang-kadang negeri di bawah. Itu karena pihak dagang dalam lautan India umumnya datang dari Timur Tengah dan India dengan angin musim, angin monsoon winds, angin musim. Jadi India, Timur Tengah dan Eropa dianggap di atas angin, dan Asia Tenggara di bawah angin. Dan itu juga diterima oleh beberapa penulis dalam bahasa Arab dan Farsi. Juga kalau menulis tentang Siam, Montai, juga dianggap tanah di bawah angin. Jadi saya ambil ini sebagai bukti bahwa ada suatu ide Asia Tenggara di dalam, bukan saja di luar. Kalau orang luar, misalnya orang Cina, ada Nanyangnya, orang Jepang ada Nampaunya, tapi dari dalam bagaimana? And that's the only thing I could come up with. So kenapa sultan-sultan masih hebat di Malaysia? Maybe this is too complicated and I'm getting tired. I'll speak in English, but it starts with the colonial period, that the British idea of indirect rule was a little different from the Dutch idea. Maybe because the British were kerajaan, seperti Johor dan Perak dan segalanya. They understood about monarchy and this sort of theater of monarchy, how you defer to the king. Yeah, it's part of your patriotism. And I think for the Dutch, they didn't have a king. They thought actually kings were zaman lampau, this is kuno sekali. I mean, deep down they believe that these rajas are anachronistic. They don't really belong in the modern world. They look down on the rajas. And you can read that in there, especially in Sumatra Timur, where they had to deal with these raja yang kaya sekali dan main-main. And, they were not very modern, reform-minded rajas that they were dealing with. And they didn't, I think the nationalists absorbed some of that idea that the really, these are not people you look up to as a sort of symbol. They're rather divisive figures who are fundamentally useless and take up a lot of resources. The British did really try quite hard to boost the idea of the Raja as symbol of independence.
Okay.
So that, there were stamps. The Perak had a stamp with the Raja's head on it, like the British Queen. They had these symbols of monarchy and independence as if they really were, but of course everybody knew the British ran things. But they boosted the idea, they liked the idea, it was a romantic idea of the Sultan as symbolic leader. So I think some of that, certainly in the education system, they learned about that. The people who planned the education system in Malaya were believers in the idea that we are not here to reform Malay society, but to preserve it. So they, whereas the Dutch really did think they were here to, the course, the ethical policy was to, improve Indonesians, educate, and so fundamentally make them into more modern phenomena. I think that, so it starts with the colonial, but in the end, there was an ethnic factor. The Rajas were the Malay Rajas were always Malay. The Semenanjung dan di Sumatra, they were Malay, and both Semenanjung and Sumatra Timur were pluralist sekali. There were a lot of different ethnic groups. And in East Sumatra, I suppose fundamentally, the kaum Melayu were not the biggest or strongest ethnic group, suku, not very, not in a position to control the others. So whereas in Semenanjung and Malaya, they were the only ones who claimed to be indigenous. Of course, many of them came from Indonesia, but anyway, they claimed to be indigenous, and but endangered. And the British, on the whole, supported that idea that the Malays have special position under their sultans. So it was a fight among the British after the war. Do we support the Rajas and this Semenanjung as Tanah Melayu, or do we support a kind of modern, equal citizen idea, that everybody's equal citizen, like more or less the Indonesian idea, and we call it Malaya, Federation of Malaya. There were two different ideas, and the UMNO, the dominant Malay party, supported the idea that no, the Malays first, Ketuhanan Melayu and all that. So I mean, whereas the suku Melayu di Sulawesi Timur juga mendukung Sultan, maybe 70%.
Yeah.
And the radicals, the pergerakan was mostly Minang, Mandailing, Batak, a little bit Java, not so much Malay. It's hard to find Malay leaders. So, I mean, there was a suku element in that they, and also Medan was under Dutch authority. So in Medan, you're free to do whatever you want, except criticize the Dutch, except demand independence. Whereas if you're in a Kesultanan, like Delhi or Langkat, di bawah Raja, they said, oh, you have to be Sunni Islam, Shafi, you have to be tunduk from our idea of what Melayu is. And you should not be, for example, Muhammadiyah. Muhammadiyah was up, so if you read Hamka, Hamka was Muhammadiyah. He had some fights with the Rajas. So too long. Last one. Literacy rate. The simple thing that it's a very interesting subject, and more should be written about it, about the extent of literacy in these old scripts, the scripts that we think of as unimportant. I mean, we hardly learn about it, I think, in school. The script of everybody in Sumatra, Lampung, Minang, Mandailing, Batak, and then in Sulawesi Selatan, aksara Bugis dan Makassar, dengan aksara yang lain sekali. It's not like Javanese, more Sanskrit based, but it's a different one. And those, we know it especially from Sumatra Selatan and Lampung, that the literacy was very high in this old aksara because the courtship, how you cari suami istri, is through love letters. You wrote letters in this old script, and if you didn't know how to do that, you didn't get a wife or a husband. So that was a very strong motive to learn this alphabet. And other things it was used for too, but it was not used for writing histories or writing about big formal things, but it was used a lot for love letters, and that was a very high. So this is an example that it was not taught from school. It was not taught from the surah or the mosque. It was taught from the mothers teaching their daughters and so forth. And it was taught in the household, but it reached a very high level. and they say it's, I mean, there are sources saying the same thing about the Philippines in that old, they had the old, it's a kind of aksara that it's good for writing on bamboo. I mean, you make straight lines across the thread of the bamboo. And so it's not any circular movements. But so, I mean, one could talk more about this, but I encourage you, if you want to study this, please, somebody should show more interest in Indonesia about these old alphabets, which of course dying very quickly, but you know, it's important.
Yeah, thank you Pak Tony. Tadi Pak Tony sudah menjawab tentang commonalities atau persamaan di Asia Tenggara. Jadi ya kita harus melihat material culture, misalkan benda-benda yang digunakan dalam kehidupan sehari-hari masyarakat Asia Tenggara sebagai sebuah commonalities, sebagai sebuah kesamaan. Kemudian juga kita lihat pertanian, kita lihat juga makanan, itu beberapa aspek yang kita bisa lihat sebagai sebuah kemiripan, ya. Jadi budaya di Asia Tenggara. Kemudian tadi juga Pak Tony menjelaskan tentang kenapa dia menggunakan istilah bawah angin. Well, actually it remind me of Pramudia Ananta Tours. Dia sebut negeri atas angin to depict people who came from the north, actually. Negeri atas angin, and then you made the negeri bawah angin as the title of your book, which is very interesting. And then Pak Tony juga tadi sudah menjawab tentang tentang raja di Malaysia. Well, actually, was it related? I mean, in Indonesia, was it related to Daendels? Because during Daendels' period, he was integrated the aristocrat and the royal family to the bureaucracy system of colonial. And then I don't know what had happened in Malaysia. Did it also happen in Malaysia? Because in Indonesia, as we all know, Daendels trying to integrate the royal family in the one bureaucratic system under colonial.
Tapi itu bukan Indonesia, itu Jawa.
Ya,
itu Jawa.
Oke.
Jawa saja. Karena Daendels tidak punya kuasa di Sumatra umumnya. And when the Dutch came to Sumatra after Daendels, and with all these sultans, they made long treaties with each one. They made treaties. So it was, they were much less bureaucratized. And partly, it was this business of tiga pihak, karena Inggris di Penang dan Singapura selalu mengkritis kemajuan Belanda di Sumatera, karena itu merugikan kebebasan dagang dengan Penang. Penang dan Singapura merasakan diri pusat dagang untuk Sumatera, dan pusat apa lagi, pusat komunikasi dan pendidikan segala. Straits dollar itu menjadi currency of the Sumatra. So the Dutch didn't dare to be quite so crass with the Rajas in Sumatra, and except the Sultan Aceh. I mean, that was bodoh sekali. Really, the Dutch were very stupid to abolish the Sultan of Aceh, and then they gave themselves a whole bag full of problems. They had to control all those ulubalangs. It was hard enough for the Sultan, but without the Sultan, it was extremely difficult, and it took them so much problem. And but in general, they seldom made that. I mean, they made that in Rio. Eventually, they they abolished the Sultan. But mostly they kept, and Minyak, of course, they never had.
Okay. Okay. But in Java also, the colonial system maintained Portland, London to Sultanate, Jogja, and also Solo.
Yeah.
They have a kind of autonomy.
Yeah, that's right, and it's kind of unique, that autonomy of the Fürstenland, which is it's interesting that how Georgia survived the revolution. It was close. I mean, nobody else survived really, but just that one. And it's not because he was the only one who supported the Republic, but he was also quite smart in the way he Mendukung Republic, and like the Republic to be there in Jogja, and that was very clever. With Solo, didn't make it, and none of the. I mean, in Sumatra too, there were sort of Republican sultans who tried to be very pro Republic, but they didn't get. It didn't help them. They still got dibastingkan.
Baiklah. Tadi jadi berpanjang-panjang mengenai kedudukan feodalisme di dalam kolonialisme, karena di Indonesia, di Hindia Belanda, kedudukan feodalisme kalau dalam istilahnya multatuli atau Edward Dawes Dekker disebutkan bahwa rakyat khususnya di Jawa dicambuk oleh dua kekuasaan. Jadi kekuasaan kolonial dan kekuasaan feodal. Dan ternyata kalau dibandingkan di Malaysia, Inggris menjadikan raja sebagai simbol, dan juga kemudian setelah kemerdekaan raja tetap dijadikan simbol, dan UMNO waktu itu ada dua pertentangan tadi disebutkan oleh Pak Tony antara pendukung dari federasi kerajaan ataukah mau menjadi negara yang equal, yang sama seperti Indonesia, tidak ada lagi feodalisme. Nah, kemudian UMNO memilih itu karena sebagai simbol bukan superiority, tapi simbol kesatuan dari Melayu, kira-kira seperti itu ya. Mungkin juga untuk mendominasi secara politik, kan? Tadi sudah dijelaskan juga. Nah, memang ini menarik kalau kita teruskan, ini banyak sekali. Saya mau tanya panitia, ini sudah selesai waktunya ya? Sampai jam 12 atau sampai jam setengah 12?
11.40 Pak, boleh?
Oh, sudah selesai ya? Oh 11. Oh, kita masih punya 6 menit lagi ya. Kalau 6 menit sudah habis lagi, nanti panjang lagi. Pak Tony juga sudah hampir 2 jam bicara ya. Jadi diskusi ini sangat menarik. Kawan-kawan, buku ini penting. Menjadi buku yang sangat penting karena memberikan perspektif yang luas tentang Indonesia khususnya sebelum kita mengenal Indonesia sebagai negara modern. Kita melihat bagaimana jaringan kebudayaan, jaringan perdagangan, kemudian persamaan budaya, kemudian kedudukan perempuan, bagaimana ada pandemi, bagaimana masyarakat di Asia Tenggara merespon setiap fenomena politik, sosial, bahkan menghadapi wabah gitu, sebagai satu wilayah yang sangat beragam, dan ini memperluas cakrawala berpikir kita untuk melihat keberagaman di Asia Tenggara yang kemudian kita absorb, kita adopsi ya, menjadi sebuah Indonesia, dan itu sisanya kita masih bisa lihat gitu ya. Jadi buku ini memberikan perspektif yang sangat luas karena dia juga ditulis dengan cara yang menarik dan melihat secara total fenomena sejarah. Sebetulnya tadi saya ingin bertanya lagi kepada, actually I would like to ask you about a contrafactual question. How if colonialism was never come to Indonesia or to Southeast Asia? You know, That is a contrafactual question actually, but make me wonder. Maybe there is no Indonesia. Maybe there is no Malaysia as a modern state. Of course, maybe we only have a kingdom, sultanate. Ya. Tapi itu tidak terjadi. Jadi semacam pertanyaan kontrafaktual. Apa yang terjadi seandainya kolonialisme tidak pernah datang ke Asia Tenggara? Mungkin Pak Tony mau jawab lagi?
Ada waktu?
Ya, silakan Pak.
Well, I mean, what we usually think about Thailand as a place that didn't have colonialism. And I think that about Aceh sometimes. You know, in around 1840, 1850, 1860, Aceh was maybe the most successful independent state in Southeast Asia. Well, now Vietnam was also quite strong, but I mean, we always compare, you know, how come, you know, in mainland Southeast Asia, you have Burma, you have Muay Thai and Vietnam. And how come Vietnam and Burma got colonized, but Muay Thai did not? And it's usually, well, you know, the powers, English and French, they needed a buffer. So the English particularly said,
Buffer zone.
Buffer state, we better to keep the English and the French domains. And of course, in Thailand, they say it's because Raja kita yang pintas sekali, you know, he played his cards so well. He modernized, like the Japanese, you know, he modernized and cooperated with the British especially, but not too much. So when it was the railway, he got the Germans to build the railways. And when it was something else, I'll say they're building palaces, and so you got the Italians, they know about style, and the British for commerce and stuff like that. So to keep them all happy and balanced, there's some of that, of course. But when I look, you know, nobody. Well, I wrote something recently just trying to compare Aceh with that. Why? You know, we don't usually say, what did Aceh do wrong? I mean, we say a lot, what did Burma do wrong? Or what did Vietnam do wrong? Vietnam, you know, was quite stuck in its traditional Neo-Confucian relationship with China. You know, they asked the Chinese to come and help them against the French. The king wanted to keep things very traditional, according to that Confucian. We usually say that about that, simply, whereas the Thais were more flexible, the king was able to adjust and let the British have enough. And in Burma, actually, well, it was closer to making it. But in the case of Aceh, I think what in this article, which I wrote up, I ended up saying it was maybe what the Acehnese are very proud of, that they felt themselves very Islamic. And they didn't need to play the game of Britain. You know, you might have said they should have played Britain against the Dutch. They should have done that right through the 19th century to get on side with the British, because the British really had an interest in keeping Aceh separate because of all the pepper trade, and you know, the trade was quite important to Penang and Singapore. But just at the time when it started to be important, the Sultan Ibrahim seemed to be excited about Islamic revival, and the British, you know, there was a rebellion in India, 1857, and apparently a lot of refugees from the rebels, the anti-British rebels, came to Aceh to save themselves, looking for a safe place outside India that was Islamic. And they encouraged him to, you know, have no time, no time for the British. Just so he actually insulted the British envoy who came next time, and told him to go away. So I mean, it's partly you could think of it that way. We don't usually think of it that way because, of course, Indonesian nationalist history wants to say Aceh is inherently Indonesian, but it wasn't. It was a little more oriented towards the Indian Ocean, towards India and Timor Tengah, and towards Malaya. And but yeah, so but that doesn't answer your question, the counterfactual. But when you look at Thailand, if it was like that, it was not so different. You know, in other words, they accommodated the strong economic powers, the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians. I mean, they accommodated them, but within a sort of a monarchy system. But they still did what the British wanted in essentials. So whether, I mean, that, or I mean, if the counterfactual has to say, well, what if the Europeans were not so strong in the 19th, early 20th century? But they were. So how do you keep them out? I mean, you can't keep them out, but you can play the game in a different way, in different ways. Yeah.
Thank you, Pak. Terima kasih. Itu pertanyaan iseng kalau kata orang Indonesia, but I'm not trying to teach you anyway. Anyway, thank you, Pak. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us today. It's indeed very important for us to hear your thought about the history of Southeast Asia, about about the similarity, about the commonalities of people in Southeast Asia. Terima kasih sekali, Pak. Kepada kawan-kawan yang ingin mendapatkan buku Asia Tenggara dalam Kurun Niaga ini, bisa mengisi link yang sudah ditulis oleh Obor, oleh panitia. Ini ada linknya di chat box. Anda bisa klik untuk mendapatkan harga spesial. Ini buku penting, 2 jilid buku. Ditulis tadi seperti kata Pak Tony, 10 tahun ya Pak, menulis. Dan apa yang membedakan Pak Tony, misalkan tadi menjelaskan agak secara kritis, kalau di Cornell University sebagai pusat kajian Asia Tenggara itu melihat ke setiap negara, Indonesia, Muang Thai, Vietnam, Burma, Malaysia. Tapi Pak Anthony kemudian menuliskan itu dalam 2 jilid buku dengan sangat menarik, sampai disebut ini proyek yang sangat ambisius, tapi dia berhasil menyelesaikan buku ini, sehingga menurut saya menjadi sangat penting untuk kita baca, untuk kita telaah, dan untuk kita kritis tentu saja, untuk melahirkan pemikiran-pemikiran baru dari buku Pak Anthony Reid ini, karena menurut saya pribadi yang terpenting setelah membaca buku adalah inspirasi apa yang dihasilkan dari membaca buku itu. Mungkin ada nanti teman-teman sejarawan yang di sini terinspirasi juga untuk menulis kajian lain, membantah tesisnya Pak Anthony Reid sehingga menjadi dinamis ya penulisan sejarah di kita mengenai Asia Tenggara dan khususnya mengenai Indonesia. Demikian, terima kasih. Sekali lagi saya mengucapkan terima kasih yang sebesar-besarnya buat Pak Anthony Reid. Thank you so much, Pak. Tetap jaga kesehatan, panjang umur, kami doakan supaya kita bisa berjumpa lagi. Because I'm very happy to have you here virtually. You are from Canberra and we are from Indonesia. Masih bisa bertemu secara online dengan kecanggihan teknologi. Well, this is not kind of blessing in disguise during this pandemic outbreak. You know, we have this such technology that connect us dari Jakarta ke Canberra. Terima kasih semuanya, pada panitia terima kasih, kita sudah selesai. Saya nggak tahu setelah ini ada apa panitia, foto bersama atau apa, ini terlalu banyak, ada 165 lebih saya lihat, 139. Berikutnya saya serahkan kepada panitia. Tugasnya sudah selesai. Pak Tony, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak, dan terima kasih sekalian untuk diskusi. Ya.
Ya.
Terima kasih. Oke. Bye.
Ya. Panitia silakan mengambil alih.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Boni. Terima kasih Pak Antoni. Kita foto bersama dulu. Dimohon untuk videonya dibuka ya teman-teman. Oke, siap.
Pak Tony-nya masih ada?
Pak Tony-nya sudah keluar sepertinya.
Tidak ada Pak Tony, adanya Pak Boni aja udah.
Ada Pak Boni, ya. Sama aja Pak. Siap ya, saya hitung 1, 2, 3. Tahan dulu. 1, 2, 3. Oke. Slide kedua, boleh? Videonya dibuka. Siap, tahan dulu ya. 1, 2, 3. Oke, slide ketiga, wah tidak ada video. Baik, sampai slide 2 saja.
Oh gitu.
Ya, terima kasih teman-teman.
Ya, semuanya terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mas Boni.
Sama-sama. Ya, semuanya sorry kalau ada kurang-kurang. Ya,
Ya, terima kasih.
sehat-sehat semuanya.